welcome the NCSC's Director for National Resilience, Jonathan Ellison, OBE.
Good afternoon. At the National Cybersecurity Centre, we've warned about the widening gap between the threats we face and the defences that are in place to protect us. We've talked at length about how the threat has evolved in scale, in complexity, and in sophistication. To stay ahead of the threat, we need a response that brings together policymakers, regulators, infrastructure operators, and the wider cybersecurity industry, a whole-of-system response. I'm Jonathan Ellison. I'm the NCSC's Director for National Resilience, and it's my pleasure to chair today's panel, sponsored by Palo Alto, bringing together such a group with diverse perspectives from central government, from regulators, and from industry to talk about the approaches we can take to build the UK's collective resilience. So I'll quickly introduce this esteemed panel that I've got in front of me, and then we'll crack on to talk about what it means to be resilient in the current environment. So I'm joined by, at the far end, starting at the far end, Nihal Newman, who's the Director of Network Security Policy at Ofcom. Rod Latham, the Director for Cybersecurity and Digital Identity at the Department for Science, Innovation and Tech, DCIT. Emma Smith, the Global Chief Information Security Officer for Vodafone. Gemma Thomas, Director for State Threats, Cyber and Technology at the Cabinet Office. Suman Ziaula, the Head of Technology, Resilience and Cyber at the Financial Conduct Authority. And last but not least, Charlie, our Deputy Director for Assessments here at the National Cybersecurity Centre. So I thought we would spend the next 45 minutes or so talking first about the threat, what it means to be resilient in the current threat environment, different approaches that have been taken in different critical sectors, how we can encourage cross-sector work and cross-sector collaboration, a bit about the current and future regulatory environment, and then how we make sure we mitigate not just today's threats, but those of the future too. Charlie, if I can start with you, can you just set this in context for us? So given the cyber threat environment and how it's evolving, what are the most significant emerging threats that we should be aware of, and how can we start to think about a whole-of-system response as we deal with them?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. So my team, Assessment, we're inside the NCSC, and it's our job really to talk about the future of global cyber threats. And to do that on behalf of the NCSC, but also wider government, industry, academia, all of you that are sat in this room, frankly, because you've heard John talk about it a bit, you've heard Richard, our CEO, and the Minister this morning talk about it as well. We do say that cyber threat is growing, and we do say that at the minute it's outstripping resilience. Why do we say the threat is growing? I think there's 3 points that I'd really want to draw out. The first is, and you could see it in the news just overnight, we are in a it's really a sustained period of international competition. The environment, the geopolitical environment, is more adversarial than it has been arguably at any point since pre-World War II. So we are in a period of time where there is sustained competition, but there's also really acute crises, and there's conflict as well. And I think more so than many of us can remember in our lifetimes. And cyber is a tool that threat actors, whether they be state or non-state, use. And they use it actively. It's a discrete capability that they can use to have effect within that competition, that crisis, and that conflict. You know, it's covert, it's difficult to attribute, and it's really, really effective. So the first thing to recognize is that we are in a geopolitical environment that is deeply, deeply difficult for all of us as institutions to respond to and to plan forward in, and that is increasing the threat. Therefore, what we see off the back of that is more incidents, the impacts of those incidents increasing as well. And within that, what we see is persistent challenges from state actors who are operating at scale, they have real sophistication and the ability to shape international systems in their favor as well. And that just compounds the challenges, the acute challenges that we already had from cyber criminals, from hacktivism, even from individuals, right? And so we have a broad set of threat actors who are getting engaged with this. But then the second point that I really want to draw out as well is that we've had a fairly stable set of actors for a long time. And actually what we're seeing is those set of actors growing, those threat actors. And partially that's because of commercial proliferation. So the ability to buy active cyber capabilities. Okay, and there's a lot about that in the press, but we're therefore seeing many more actors being able to buy, often for a legitimate purpose and for a malicious purpose, commercial cyber capability. And the other thing that we're seeing routinely is the advances in technology are really lowering the barriers for entry. So whereas once upon a time, the kind of advanced cyber offense and cyber defense capabilities that we're talking about today were largely in the hand of state actors, they're not anymore. There's been a proliferation commercially, but there's been a proliferation just of low barrier to entry technology that means many, many more individuals even can pose a cyber threat. And therefore, I think the third point is we're also dealing, many of you will be dealing with this day to day, with an attack surface that is increasing. The things that we need to look after, there's more of them. Right? They're more complex, they're more interconnected. We are ever more dependent on technology. So it's not just the threat is increasing, the areas to attack are increasing as well. And our assessment is that AI and other emerging technologies, and really when I talk about AI at the minute, I mean the kind of extant machine learning, the things that have been around for a long time, is actually really starting to accelerate that. So a good example of that kind of lowering the barrier to entry is that, once upon a time, if you were a cyber criminal writing a phishing email, it would be quite obvious often that you may not be a native English speaker, and that was our best line of defense. And now you can run that through a jailbroken GPT, and it comes out almost perfect. And radically increases the efficiency and the effectiveness of that. So, we talk about cyber threat growing, and it's because, it's an adversarial environment. There are more threat actors. They are more capable. They are utilizing technology better, and they're using it in persistent and really acute fashion to progress their goals against this really contested geopolitical environment. And I think what you'll see and hopefully hear from the panel today is why it's so important, therefore, that actually we can't, it's difficult to draw out any single cyber threat trend that we need to respond to. Right? There are multiple overlapping cyber threat issues, and we can only respond to that in a whole of system fashion, and one that really, really prioritizes resilience. Because I think the final point that I want to leave you on is the cyber threat is growing, and if it's outstripping our resilience, what that means is that often we haven't made life hard enough for those threat actors. Right, and they are still exploiting things that they shouldn't. Sophisticated actors operating in non-sophisticated ways because they just don't need to. And really, when I think about resilience, to me, that's a lot of what it's about. How do we defend from attack, and how do we respond from that? And really understand that cyber threat landscape as it is at the minute. So, John, I hope that isn't. I often get people joke with me that I should wave a bell before I come around in government because it's pretty grim generally, but it is unfortunately a grim landscape, and it's a grim geopolitical conditions. And that's the reality of what we have to deal with now as cyber defenders.
It's grim, but I hope over the course of the 40 minutes, you'll be left with a sense of optimism about how we respond.
I won't speak again either, so.
Emma, can I turn to you? So working at Vodafone as the global CISO, you have to cope with that whole range of threat environments that Charlie just talked about. So resilience is a term that means many different things to many different people in different contexts, in different sectors, in different countries. So for you as a global CISO for such a big firm like Vodafone, what does that mean to you when we talk about resilience? And how do we make sure that we can build that kind of resilience that we need in the context of what Charlie's just been talking about?
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks, Charlie. I thought you set the scene perfectly for us, and this morning did the same, because we can see the volatility of the threat landscape that we're all up against. I hope that it's not outstripping our resilience and all the defenders that are working hard to fight the good fight. But partly today's panel is about unpicking what does that really mean, and how do we make the shifts that we need to make to defend against those threats. I've been at Vodafone for 10 years as the group CISO. Before that, I was a CISO for a large bank. The controls that we implement haven't changed radically over the last 10 to 15 years, and we probably are all broadly aligned on the key controls that we think mitigate risk and threat. And I think now what we're all talking about when we talk about cyber resilience is what is that next step between security and resilience. The way I like to think about it is that we're never finished in security, and resilience is that ongoing, continuous improvement. We're never finished, this sort of restlessness for keeping improving security. I really like NIST's definition of resilience. It talks about anticipating the threats, which is what Charlie and the insights we get from working with entities like NCSC and other partners around the world. So understand the threat actors, their motives, their techniques, but also understanding our own organisations and what we're there to protect, and understanding the services that are most important to our customers, to the societies that we operate in. And then it's about withstanding. So think about those layers of defence that we've talked about for many years and the security controls. How do we build those in a way, whether it's reducing the blast radius, whether it's making sure they can't get to critical systems, whether it's that ability to kind of bounce back quickly or ring fence or detect quickly, so the ability to withstand attacks. And then we think about recovery. So how do we have playbooks, teams that are tested, all the resources that we need to build to recover from incidents? Because incidents and attacks will happen. And having that normalised so that it happens, but actually our job is then to make the impact as small as possible to our organisations and to society, is really important. And then NIST finished by talking about adaptability. And adaptability to me means the ability to move and evolve as threats change. Ideally, we will be anticipating those threats, but also to make sure we're evolving in line with technology evolution and really embracing new technologies, both to allow our companies and societies the opportunity to thrive, but also as defenders utilising new technologies to protect ourselves. So I think that's a really good definition. To me, there's an extra piece of that, though, which is that I can't be resilient in Vodafone on my own, as an organisation. We can't be. We need to be collectively resilient with our counterparts in telecommunications, with the supply chain that we work with, across the other critical national infrastructure sectors. So for me, resilience encompasses this partnership and collaboration that's cross-sector, cross-society.
I think we'll definitely come back to that cross-sector society point shortly. Nihal,
I just
please
to jump in for a second, because I just observed a point that you made, that controls in the banking sector and controls in the telecom sector are not that different.
They're not.
So, maybe that is a key message for us as well from today. But, as Jonathan said, we'll touch on cross-sector
definitely
stuff.
come back to that. Gemma, perhaps, and come to you just for a central government perspective, right? Sitting in the heart of government in the Cabinet Office, this concept of resilience, which we hear a lot, what does it mean in terms of this new government's kind of agenda, thinking, and how do you see it shaping the future of cybersecurity?
Yeah, sure. And I think Charlie, he's really set the scene in terms of the threat picture trajectory, which is, pretty scary. So I think, in terms of what we do about it, Emma's covered a part of that in terms of the resilience picture. I think, for me, being resilient is just being able to withstand those shocks and disruption when they occur, and it's all about the ability to recover, quickly. We've seen a few pretty big incidents happen. Obviously, CDL this morning spoke about the CrowdStrike impact that was felt last year. Myself and Rod's teams have been doing some follow-up work on how we can better improve response across the system to that. But it was just such a big wake-up call, and we've had quite a few after it. And clearly, the current retail disruption is pretty unfortunate to see. So, threat picture growing, looking scarier. I think we have a shared understanding of resilience. So what do we need to do with that shared understanding? And I think, the key bit of this is around having a shared approach to tackling that and really understanding what the barriers are to adoption. So, we're speaking to the home team here, Cyber UK. We have a room full of deeply technical experts and people doing this, actually living this day in, day out. How can we help you reach your boards and the C-suite so that we get those messaging through, and cyber is taken seriously as a strategic business risk? So I'm really interested in getting into that through discussion. At the government level at the moment, as you mentioned, John, we have a not-so-new set of ministers, but they've been clear that cyber is a huge priority for all of the reasons around underpinning secure and resilient growth, which is hugely important. Cyber is now part of the industrial strategy, huge shift in focus across the system on that. And we have a new cyber security and resilience bill coming through, which Rod will save Rod to go through that in more detail. But that's really exciting, huge opportunity. That will be a step change. So very keen to drive that through. And then, as announced by CDL this morning, we will be updating our national cyber strategy. And I think the whole of system, whole of society approach will probably survive contact of our strategic refresh. You know, it's good, it's a good strategic framework, but just coming back to an earlier point, what we haven't got right is understanding the barriers to adoption of resilience measures, and we haven't cracked that nut. So through the development of the strategy over the next couple of months, really keen to take views and work really closely with industry, regulators, and everyone just to understand how we can, you know, really get under that, to understand how we can make it easier.
Thank you. Let's go to that cross-sector collaboration point, Nihal, that you raised. But Emma, so we're lucky on this panel. We've got both telecoms and the finance sector represented from the kind of set of opinions that we've got on the stage today. So maybe Emma, start with you from an industry perspective, and then Nihal, if you want to jump in from the regulator perspective. But how do we foster collaboration between sectors? How do we have that shared understanding across different industries? What are the benefits of that? How do we work collaboratively? Emma, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, well, I think threat intelligence sharing is the platform that probably we start with in most sectors. And what I observe is that threat intelligence sharing is often good within sector, but a little bit harder to orchestrate cross sector. And that could be because we don't have the contacts, or actually the threats might vary per sector. And it tends to be based on trust and relationships and things that have grown over time. So I think we're very lucky in the UK to have NCSC as the industry face. And I'm not saying that just because you're here, Jonathan, and I'm on this panel. We genuinely are very lucky. I work across a global footprint, and I think we're pretty unique in the way that we work with government and industry together. So we're lucky to have that. But I think the next step is about how do we bring together cross-sector groups of people that can not just share threat intelligence and be in reactive mode to things that are happening to us today, but perhaps collaborate on topics that are more future-orientated and are more about shared investment in things that will protect us in the future. I worked in banking for 13 years before telco, and the banks were very, very good at running joint projects, particularly when there was a burning platform or a specific threat that was targeting the sector. We used to come together, and sometimes we would co-invest in sponsoring the development of solutions. And if you think about it, at the moment, every organisation, no matter how big or small, we're all trying to solve the same problems. And so there's quite a lot of duplication in the way we work at the moment. We're maybe good at collaborating on threats, but actually where I think there's a big opportunity is to collaborate more on solutions and work together on how we solve problems, particularly because we're not competing. In the way I think about it in the telco space, I'm not competing with the other telcos on security. I want the telco sector to be as strong and resilient as possible. So it's in my interest to try and bring communities together and work on projects together. We also have a shared ecosystem, shared supply chain. We've got single points of dependency within that supply chain, and I think there's a really important point where we can come together to help lift the whole ecosystem and you know, probably move a little bit away from some of the work we've been doing historically on supply chain assurance and questionnaires to actually look at how do we lift the ecosystem that we all work and collaborate with. So I think there's a huge amount of things we could be doing. We've got a great platform in the UK to do that and a great relationship of trust.
I'll move us to the financial sector in a second, but Nihal, did you want to come in from Ofcom's perspective?
I think the key thing is for us is not just on the telecom side, it's also drawing our learnings on the digital infrastructure, because I cover stuff over there. And it's about when we do the assurance, we do the assessments, it's about sharing that information as well. What is the commonality we are seeing across the different sectors that we work with? But it's also leaning in. It has to be solution focused. We focus so much on the problem and not on the solution. So a lot of things that we're starting to do is, what is the solution we're trying to do? There's great work we've kicked off on the power resilience side at the back of the storms and the issues we're seeing over there as well, but we're working with the energy sector over there. It's not something that any sector should start looking at solutions independently. But I'm sure on the finance side, there is some cooperation that's going to be happening there, but I'll let Suman come in on that.
Suman, do you want to pick up?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And firstly, good afternoon, everybody. I wanted to do a slight detour, if I might, which was I asked ChatGPT before coming out here what the best music might be to walk onto stage on, because we were having this, you know, music, fireworks. I was expecting full-on cannons, frankly, it came out with two things. One of them was "Come Together" by the Beatles, which I'm not sure would have been entirely appropriate in Manchester. And the other one was Heroes by David Bowie. And I thought, actually, if I look at, what did you call it, Gemma, the home team that we're talking to at the moment, it really feels like we are in a room full of heroes, because that's really what we're needing when we're looking to try and counter these evolving threats. Let me come to the topic, though. So from an FCA perspective, we see cyber resilience as part of an organization's overall operational resilience. And if we look at operational resilience, there's that encompasses a lot of things. That encompasses IT outages, as we talked about this morning. It encompasses third-party failures, fires at substations, global pandemics, conflict and supply chain disruption that could happen there, or natural disasters. And of course, we've seen all of these things happen, haven't we? Exactly as Emma was saying, disruptions are inevitable, cyber attacks are inevitable. We can't prevent them all. And we do say that really clearly. We try to make sure that when we're looking at resilience, we're asking organizations to prepare to try and minimize the chances of that disruption happening, but then also to be ready to be able to respond well so that the harm that arises is as small as possible. But clearly, when you put it in that context, you can't have organizations operating alone. It can't be regulators that are operating alone. We can't regulate our way out of this. What it needs is innovation, it needs collaboration, it needs knowledge sharing. Frankly, it needs an awful lot of hard work and continuous investment. And it needs that collaboration to happen between businesses, between regulators, with third-party suppliers, and also with academics. And just if I mention a few of the things that we're doing in the financial sector to try and foster that kind of that collaboration, we convene industry groups, and we convene, for example, the FCA has cyber collaboration groups where we have about 120 CISOs from the largest firms that we regulate coming together in a safe space, a space where they have knowledge that they're not about to get smacked over the head by a regulator, which is difficult to establish, I must say, to share ideas, share solutions, as Neil was saying. We've also got a whole alphabet soup of organizations and groups that we have: CMORG, the BOC, CMBCG, the ORCG, TAPRG, there's going to be a test on this later, the CIO Forum. We're very good at acronyms. That's the message there. But really, that's an opportunity for us to learn from each other and to allow industry to learn from each other in how to approach this. There's an awful lot of domestic and international regulatory collaboration. We work really closely with a whole range of partners, including NCSC, including the Cabinet Office, including other regulators in other forums, but also internationally in how we do that. Somebody this morning earlier was talking about how important it is that we have some convergence across different regulatory frameworks internationally, and that's something that we're really, really keen on, because it does reduce the regulatory burden, which is very important. We publish a lot of material which can help firms to understand what they should be doing. I'd really encourage people, if you haven't seen it already, we have a CBEST thematics report that we publish every December that is essentially the snapshot of all the things that we've learned that year that firms aren't doing well at on cyber tests and cyber resilience, through the CBEST tests that we run on those firms, where we've done vulnerability assessments. But there's a whole range of other things: lessons learned after the CrowdStrike incident, or operational resilience assessments where we've drawn things out. And then the final piece is that we do an awful lot of cross-sector exercising. And that can be things like preparing for a catastrophic cyber attack. It could be a national power outage. It could be something that's looking at misinformation, malinformation, disinformation. And really, what that's telling us an awful lot is not just that firms need to collaborate with each other and regulators need to collaborate with each other, but also firms and regulators need to learn from each other as well.
Thank you. And I like that the conversation we tend to kind of concrete steps, things that are actually happening or things we're actually doing that respond to the environment that Charlie was talking about earlier on. And I think, talking about concrete steps, I think regulation and the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill is clearly one of those things, right, for this year. And so, Rob, this feels like a really good moment to bring you in to talk about the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill in the context of what we've been talking about earlier. How is this going to help us with our resilience challenges? Over to you.
Great, thank you. So I've been literally given a stage to talk about how great the legislation we're working on is, so I shall take full advantage of that. But I do feel like what I want to say first is that regulation and legislation are clearly a big part of what we need to do for transforming resilience, but they are not the only thing that we need to be doing. So this is a part of the toolkit, and as I will wax lyrical about it a little bit, but I don't want that to be interpreted as it's sort of being seen as the kind of silver bullet for everything. We really want to take a proportionate response as government into what we are regulating. Overall, this is a government that is trying to prioritise reducing the regulatory burden on businesses. So we do not introduce a kind of new regulatory piece of legislation lightly, but it does talk to the importance of it in the kind of context that Charlie set out. The bill that we're doing is effectively a kind of update on the NIS regulations that existed when we were in the European Union, and obviously the European Union have updated since. So it covers 5 sectors of CNI, and again this is around kind of that proportionality piece. It would not be proportionate to have this kind of level of mandated activity for every corner of activity in the UK economy. But when we're talking about energy, digital infrastructure, water, health, there is a need to take these kind of measures. So what we'll be doing, we issued a policy statement last month, so you're welcome to kind of access that online for more detail. We're expanding the regulation to cover more entities. So we're bringing in managed service providers. We're enabling critical suppliers to be identified and brought under the scope of the legislation. We're trying to give regulators more power and more ability to be able to act. We are changing some of the incident reporting requirements that exist. And we are also looking to kind of create a number of powers that will future-proof, so that we're not reliant on passing primary legislation for dealing with the threat. And that is what I'll just say. Sort of a couple of things about some of the challenges that we're tackling with as we look to introduce this legislation. And the first one is around that future-proofing. So when you have a threat landscape that is changing in the way that Charlie was kind of describing about how quickly things can work, legislation does not work quickly, and I talked about this a little bit in the panel this morning as well. So you've got to be conscious that you don't want to set in stone something that you'll then kind of later regret having put into primary legislation. In a previous job when I was in the Home Office, we were working on updating the Official Secrets Acts. Some of those were over 100 years old and referred to kind of, breaking wax seals and stuff. So, you've got to be careful you're not kind of creating something that works for the environment and you're in right now, but won't work down the line. So we need to be kind of cognizant of that and trying to build in a little bit of future-proofing so we can work more agilely. The second, and it builds on what Subin was saying, really around the kind of interface with other pieces of regulation. So, we do not have one single piece of cyber legislation for the entire UK economy. We have the Telecom Security Act. There are other pieces that work. So we're very mindful of that. We're mindful of the fact that a lot of businesses will be working across different jurisdictions, including into the EU. So again, we think there's a really important role here to be played in strengthening our regulation in CNI. We also want to do that in a way that is going to work for our regulators and make sure that for business this is that is not unduly onerous. So it's a really important part of our arsenal. We're really excited about it. We introduced later this year, and I think it is going to be, as Jem said, it will be a step change in what we're doing, and it is a key part of what we're going to do to rise to the challenge that Charlie laid out.
Can I pick up on that point then, around how we ensure clarity whilst adapting to evolving technologies, evolving techniques, and you also mentioned the Telecom Security Act. So Nihal sitting in Ofcom, how has that worked in your sector? How do we ensure the industry has clarity around what is expected of them and how it will evolve?
Absolutely. And I think the key thing also to bear in mind with regulation is with good regulation, you work hand in hand around investment and growth as well. And good regulation is the key term over here because it needs to be proportionate, it needs to be appropriate. And for us, we always have to ensure we understand what's the harm. What's the harm? What are the risks we're trying to address? And just rewinding back to a couple of years ago as to how the Telecom Security Act came into play was following a comprehensive risk assessment that was carried out by NCSC. Without understanding the risk in detail, it's very difficult to articulate what measures you expect operators to invest in. So following that exercise was a set of key requirements. Again, that was identified by NCSC as to how those risks could be managed, could be mitigated, but at the same time, it had to be in some sort of legal framework. So that's when we worked very closely with DCMS at that point, but now DSET, and the legal framework is now in place. It's called the Telecom Security Act, and it provides clarity because, again, with good regulation, it helps to provide clarity to industry. It enables to provide stability. And what the TSA also does is to ensure we don't put everything in a sealed bag. There's a code of practice. The measures operators need to follow in the sector is in a code of practice. So as threats evolve, as technology evolves, the code of practice can be updated. And that is absolutely key. So there is clarity in legislation, but at the same time, that is complemented by a code of practice. There's also a timetable as to when industry need to be implementing those measures by. But at Ofcom, what we're encouraging the operators to do is please come and have a conversation with us. In the team, we want to make sure that every operator has a different infrastructure, has different architecture. So if something's not working for them, we want to understand why. And that comes back to circling on solutions, having a conversation about the solution. It's so important for us to understand what is different at a different regulator or at a different organization or operator. So when we're developing our regimes, we're doing it in a very informed way. And Suman even mentioned international partners. We work very closely with our international partners because the UK cannot operate in a bubble alone. We need to not only learn from what's happening in other countries, but also see what's good practice there and what can we implement in the UK. Because again, organizations, supply chains are global. So we can't be in a position where we are saying one thing to an organization in the UK, and then Emma says, well, I can't do that in Europe. So I think that's very important. And communication, dialogue, cooperation is what's really going to help us rather than having a sort of combative relationship with the regulator. We're very keen to make sure we're at that table, we're understanding the problems so that collectively we're addressing the risks.
You want to, as an operator on the panel.
As the industry rep on the panel, I feel I have to say something on legislation and regulation. It does play a really, really important role in society around setting minimum standards. And I think you touched on a few things there. For me, it needs to be risk and threat led so that we need to be focused on the topics that actually materially have a difference on cybersecurity and resilience. I think it has to be affordable. So we have to still be able to run a business and implement legislation and regulation. And what the TSA process did with the operators was went through a full consultation process in quite a lot of depth. We consulted on a quite detailed code of practice. And the operators had a very active role in that consultation where we were talking about things that would A, take a long time, or B, might cost many, many millions of pounds, dollars, euros. So, and that then allowed for the flexibility around implementation approaches, how to approach some of the controls that were in the code of practice. If you don't work in the telco sector, it's worth going and having a look at the TSA. It's probably one of the most detailed code of practices, I think, that exists in the world because it's very prescriptive about how to manage cyber risk. But that was driven through that collaboration. But I think getting the balance right around the ability to actually implement and still thrive as a country is really important, and across Europe. And we've always got to be mindful of smaller organisations that are swept up in some of the laws and regulations, because obviously for large companies, there's a lot of machinery that goes with the implementation of laws and regulations. But actually for a small company, this is pretty challenging. This whole landscape is pretty challenging.
Absolutely. And sorry, just to build on that point, what we did, again, working with government and NCSC, the oversight of regulation is proportionate because we're focusing on the bigger operators, whereas the smaller operators, they have the legal framework, they have the code of practice, but what we're not doing is saying you have to implement these measures by a certain point in time. And that's where proportionality comes into play. Otherwise, people will really struggle, especially the small organizations.
Thank you both. I mean, the conversation's moved a little bit there onto kind of cost and investment and how we balance investment. I think one of the things that I'm interested in is how do we encourage that kind of long-term strategic investment in building resilience, and particularly offset against, I guess, two things. One, how you deal with the kind of immediate term, the immediate cyber threat or risk or whatever, as opposed to the kind of long term, but also the balance between fixing the past, legacy technology debt versus securing the future. So how do we encourage that investment in the long term? Suman, would you be happy to talk a bit about that, how that's working in the financial sector from an FCA perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So no surprise here. Long-term investment is really important, and you won't hear us saying anything other than it's completely essential. And so completely right, trying to strike that balance between immediate term and long term is crucial, but it has to be viewed in the long term. Let's put it this way, the continuous timely investment can cost a fraction of the cost of a major incident. Well, of course it does. Of course it does. We know this. What we also know is that supports economic growth. And we know that resilient firms are competitive firms, and so this is in our interests from the broader macroeconomic perspective. We've also just issued our 5-year strategy as the FCA, and gosh, that was a challenge as the head of technology resilience and cyber, being asked to think 5 years forward. When you think 5 years in technology terms, that's quite a long period, right? But really, at its heart of of that strategy, we've talked about a particular theme of trying to deepen trust in that customers can have in firms, financial firms, and in the services that they provide. And resilience is absolutely at the heart of that. So just to give you a couple of examples, just an example really of balancing that immediate versus the long term. So a good example of that, I think, is the CrowdStrike outage from last year. We published a report in September. The outage happened in July. A couple of months later, we published a report which was talking about how come the UK financial services industry actually emerged from CrowdStrike reasonably unaffected, and actually did pretty well. So certainly compared to some other sectors, certainly when you look at the global impacts of what has been called the largest IT outage in history. And actually, it was no real coincidence. What we found was that there was an awful lot of firms that had done some real basics right. So they'd been mapping their services and then understanding exactly what the resources were that they needed to get those back online. They had been training their staff and their leadership on what they should be doing in an instant response situation. They were preparing for what would happen if multiple of their services were impacted at the same time, so that it wasn't just one that they had to recover, but they had to recover a lot simultaneously. They had their comms plans, including their comms with regulators, tested and run through and known about in advance. They had clear escalation pathways, including to the board, and they had the boards engaged. We talked about that earlier. And they reviewed incidents after they'd happened and then made sure that they were learning the lessons and then implementing those in how they set themselves up. Really, the headline out of that is that they had resilience permeating their culture, and it really wasn't just seen as a regulatory tick box exercise. And so I know you're hearing from a number of regulators here, but it's really about trying to instill that within firms, and that is a long-term approach, I think.
So just picking up on, continuing that conversation and how we ensure that kind of balance and the kind of cultural change necessary, Rod, I'm just, sitting in the kind of policy department lead for this in terms of how we get the economics right. How do we ensure sustainable resilience in the future? What's your kind of thinking?
Yeah, so cybersecurity and growth, I think we've got a really important job to do about how we're communicating this properly, and the industrial strategy is an opportunity for us to do this. So there are two cybersecurity growth stories to tell. One of them is quite an easy case to make, which is go in the hall outside and look at all the British companies that are kind of really world leading in cybersecurity. That's a really clear kind of success story that I think is pretty self-evident. The one that is harder, but we really need to land, is the bit around how cybersecurity is good for kind of building that secure and resilient growth across the economy. So cyber attacks are wiping billions of pounds off the economy each year. If we were just picking up again on the panel this morning where we were talking about things like cyber essentials, and we know that those controls can radically reduce the number of instances of successful cyber attacks. If we start to get really widespread pickup of that kind of measure and it drives that down, that is good for growth. So sometimes it falls into a trap of a sort of security versus growth. And we're doing a bit of security and it kind of comes at economic cost. I think actually finding that ability to land the narrative to sort of see how this is supporting the UK's economy writ large is something we really have to do. And again, I think new cyber strategy, the industrial strategy, there's ways in which we'll be able to do that. In terms of then around kind of the bit of how do we get investment and things. So we're looking at, we've sort of got three different strands as to how we're approaching kind of building resilience, and I think each of them has a different approach to how we're doing that. So part of it is, they all begin with I, because you have to have alliteration, even if though one of them it really doesn't work. So it's inform. This is around kind of making sure that it is as easy as possible for everyone to know what good looks like. So this is a little bit trying to then present the information to people through things like our codes of practice that we do jointly with the NCSC. So hoping there, you're kind of giving people the information so they can then make informed judgments about spending within their own businesses. We've then got incentivize, which is then trying to work out if you can't kind of persuade, how do you use sort of other tools to get people to take these up. And so again, that's things like mandating cyber essentials in government contracts. So you haven't sort of appealed to someone's sort of logic about the kind of case for cyber essentials there, but you are kind of using an incentive that people will respond to. And the third, that doesn't really work perfectly, but is instruct, which is really regulation and legislation, but it would be a sin to have two eyes and not use a third. So this is, again, what we were talking about earlier around where there is a role for regulation and legislation, and that's where you're forcing people to kind of invest in it. But again, that is a tool that we will use sparingly, and you really have to be kind of conscious that you've got a justified, proportionate case for when you're doing that.
Thank you. I think, Charlie, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, if I could just to reinforce from a threat perspective, Suman and Rod's latest points. The world is unpredictable, but I think what is fairly predictable in terms of trends is that cybercrime remains the most persistent and systematic threat to our citizens and businesses. And as long as cyber criminals can make money and they can make it in an easy fashion, that threat is going to be extant. And this resilience and this long-term planning is the key answer to that, and making ourselves a hard target over long term, and that sort of blend of measures. Because that is a trend that's going to increase. And I know it's already so difficult to counter that, but I think keeping that threat amongst others foremost is a really important part of this as well.
Thank you. I think we talked a bit about concrete steps. I think if there's one particular actionable takeaway, one particular concrete step that you really want to kind of reinforce that can best shift the dial, we're talking about transforming national resilience, right? What can best shift the dial in the current kind of climate? What would it be? I think I'm going to come to all of you, but Gemma, I'm going to come to you first.
Okay, so exercising. It sounds really basic, but have a plan. Come up with some really horrible scenarios, like really scary stuff, and test it. And test it not just with your own technical teams, but your policy teams, your operational teams, and your executive board, your ministers and your senior team. and ideally before something happens. So have a plan, test it, and do that before an incident occurs, and then really go through the kind of weak points of that response and red team it, and think hard about how you can then improve your overall response, and use it as a stimulus to encourage conversations around strategic security measures, so that cyber isn't just in its cybersecurity sort of silo. And from experience, especially with new sets of ministers and from my time in Number 10, I find it very useful to come up with very scary scenarios, sit seniors down and make them actually role play an exercise. And I think after that, you definitely do have a window of being able to talk about sort of increased measures that you can take. But that would be one thing.
Thank you. Emma?
Just building on that, about 6 years ago, I ran, in every country we operate, I went and ran a simulation with the senior team, with the CEOs and their top team. And I did it because our Italian CEO at the time said he couldn't taste and sense and feel cyber risk. And so I do think exercising is a great way of taking non-cyber professionals through real rehearsals of actually feeling what the cyber risk is like, particularly in customer terms for those running businesses that have got a large customer base. I think the one actionable thing I would say is within our sectors or outside, I think make this the moment in which you decide to go and step outside your organisation and collaborate with peers, and don't wait for any government entity to create the environment in which to do that. I think we should feel empowered as defenders to work together and bring industry peers together with the right legal frameworks, which are relatively easy to construct, in order to take some collective actions together. So that's a bit more than threat intelligence sharing, but what might we do together to strengthen and bolster the sectors that we operate in?
Thank you. Rod?
So apologies to those who are here for the panel this morning, because this is going to be a very similar one to what I said this morning. But for me, the challenge is around kind of how does this community and this audience that kind of understand these challenges, how do we communicate that to the people who don't, and who aren't going to be technical people always, or who don't have the tools available, but they are the people who we need to kind of convince and get on board, and not kind of switch off because they think they don't understand it, or it's a technical thing, or they can just sort of delegate it to CISO. So how do we be able to kind of have that impact and really land these messages with those critical people, whether they're on boards or small businesses, wherever they might be, that we are making it easy for them to engage and understand and take action.
Nihal?
I think just building on what everybody has said, firstly, I would like to say it's a great opportunity for you to approach us and tell us if you have barriers. You've got the regulators, you've got industry, you've got central government, you've got the departments here today. What are the barriers you're facing? And help us to understand those barriers. So breaking down barriers is going to be one really important thing, at least for me, to take away from today. But in terms of the key thing, from my perspective, is the leadership in the organization, making sure not only that they understand security risks, but they're committed to addressing it. It's not something that they look at on their risk register once in whatever period and then say, okay, tick, we've addressed it. Or when they see something in the media and then say, oh my God, I have to sit up straight and look at this and see what it means for my organization. It needs to be in the DNA of the organization, which takes me to the second part about risk management, and understanding risks needs to be holistic. And understanding that needs to be for everybody in the organization, not just the technical folk or the regulatory folk or the senior people. Everybody in the organization needs to be responsible for how they behave, what actions they take, and what steps that they carry out. And I think that's so important, because you don't know who your weak point is in an organization. So it is taking that end-to-end holistic approach.
Thank you. Simon?
I'll be very quick. Those are excellent points. So I've got one left, which I don't think anyone's mentioned, which is, as I've been ticking things off, which is about adapting to the evolving threat, so keeping pace with and adjusting to the evolving threat. So I don't want to talk about AI and quantum and only talk about threats. There's massive opportunities from AI and quantum, and we want to help realize those as well. But actually, as those threats are increasing, we really need to see organizations investing at the same pace as the threat is escalating in their operational and their cyber resilience. Collaborate with each other, collaborate with thought leaders, really get on top of that evolving threat and be forward-looking.
Thank you. And Charlie, you started the panel, ended it as well.
Yeah, so if you get them, read NCSC assessments and tell us how to improve them. But linked to that, I think it's really important we don't just treat cyber as a technical issue. So for us to be educated and thoughtful about the world and about the trends. And so, we talk about our leaders needing to become more technical. We need to become more literate in the world as well.
Thank you. I hope you found that a useful conversation of the kind of concrete steps that we can actually take to improve the UK's resilience in light of the threat. A massive thank you to those tuning in on YouTube. This is one of the live streamed events. Thank you to those in the room, and grateful if you could all join me in thanking this fantastic panel for their contribution today.
Please scan the QR code to evaluate this session.